And so Jamie Nelson, who's given us this wonderful space to be in today, has a few things to tell you. I'm going to let Edwin Hawkins Singers play a little behind because this is the theme song of Chicago 15. Go ahead, Jamie.
Great. I just wanted to say good morning and to welcome you on behalf of DePaul University and the DePaul University Library. I'm head of Special Collections and Archives, which I can talk about a little bit later today, what that means and why it's important. We have a couple of exhibits. You have a full day, so I don't expect you to get around to this. But we have a couple of the exhibits in the library that you might find of interest. When you came in, you might have noticed there's a Young Lords exhibit on the first floor. Right now, outside of Special Collections on the third floor, there's a small Chicago 15 exhibit.
50 years ago, Betty and I were getting ready to get married. And we got this call about this action that took place at our friend Joe Mulligan. And so we're wrapping this all in here now, and it's very present. You know, we're here now, and there are more people coming a little later. And but right now, I'd like to turn it over to my friend Joe Mulligan. We known each other a long time, and we'll turn it over to Joe.
Thank you. Again, welcome everyone. It's wonderful to be here and to see all of you. Old friends, new friends. I think it's very good and significant that we're celebrating this, you know, and the other groups have celebrated their various anniversaries, especially 50th anniversaries. Last year, I was at the Milwaukee 14 celebration in the fall of last year. The Catonsville 9 had their celebration, I guess, in the spring of last year. And it's wonderful that we're just celebrating this, and it kind of speaks to the authenticity and the goodness of what we did, and you know, the people. That we've been involved with you. So it's great. I'm crying not because I'm sad, but because I'm happy. What we're going to start with is first part of a film called Hit and Stay. It's a good film about the various draft board actions. So it gives an introduction to that whole movement. We'll show about 15 or 20 minutes of it. I think you'll get the idea. And then I'll be able to have a few more viewers of one of my videos, which I've made. I've made a few now on the Chicago 15. And so we'll see that one. You can see the building where we went in and dragged the files out of and set them on fire outside, all of that. And that one features Fred Chase. Fred Chase is one of the 15 who has not come. He's not very well, but it features him, and it shows his father also in quite moving statements by his father.
I would like you to do one more thing, Joe. Could you introduce other 15 members here in the room?
Right, of course. There's Chuck Fulenkamp, and Bill Sweeney, Bill Durkin, Margaret Katrasik, and I guess that's it. Right?
And yourself.
Yeah, well, myself.
Yay!
And also I'd like the Doyle Smith family to stand, please. And this is Tom Smith, Charles Thomas Smith died, what, 6 months ago?
A year ago.
Oh, a year ago, okay. Grace Jewett, who was married to Johnny Baranski, who was not a member of our group, but was very close and very much involved, and got further involved after our thing.
Tom Clark. I followed the Chicago 15 action with one in Evanston, a blood pouring 2 years later in April of 1971. And I'm seeing old faces for the first time in many years, as well as meeting some new ones. It's great to be with you.
Well, Joe introduced me. I'm Grace Jewett, used to be Grace Jewett Baranski. And I'm very, very happy to be here. I love celebrating resistance, and we got to keep that torch going.
Ground Zeros.
Yes, Ground Zero. It's a base hangar in Washington. Good member of that community too.
My name is Betty Check. I'm married to one of the Joes here. Have enough coffee. And I was introduced to Joe Mulligan by my husband Joe, who went to school with him. And they were present at our wedding, Joe and a number of other later indicted conspirators. So I didn't go to jail, so I don't know. That fixed everything. I was at home, we were a support network, we raised funds, we supported, and we had this third floor bedroom that actually came up in an FBI file. So I guess that's all the grace I have. And I'm so glad to see people here. I can't believe it's 50 plus years. And but I insist to continue to believe in ethics and the good that was made. And not realizing, you know, how you're in a vacuum, you're stuck with the people you have to trust. And I later learned, many years later, that over 200 draft board actions cut down a whole lot of the drafting of these 18-year-old young men, you know, to have to go to war.
Hit and stay is, you know, a professional production. The idea being hit and stay rather than hit and run.
Be here, you know, and about the fact that they didn't tell us anything. They didn't tell us what it was, other than the source that I had said this was going to be a big storm. So we knew that we were going to be covering some kind of a demonstration. We didn't know what it was, what the nature of it was, etc., and had no idea what we were doing out here. But you know, at this point, it wasn't. There were no signs. There were no big signs screaming draft board. We didn't know what we had, and again, there was a sense that whatever was happening was already underway, and that we better go quickly or we were going to miss it. We ran around, somewhat out of breath, around the side of the building, and that's when the cameraman, Bob Boyer, turned on his camera, and you see the shaky footage, and you see, I believe it was John Hogan, who actually lit the match and started the fire. When we first got there, we had no idea what we were looking at. You know, the first thing, obviously, you spotted immediately was there were two Catholic priests there. And of course, I recognized Phil Berrigan immediately, because he was a figure of some importance in the news in Baltimore at the time, and I recognized his brother Dan.
At the height of the Vietnam War, 9 Catholics entered this white frame building in Catonsville, with a draft board. The 9, some of them Catholic priests, seized Selective Service files. They brought those files out into this parking lot and then burned them with the help of homemade napalm.
But of course, the striking thing about the Catonsville 9, this wasn't your usual protest with scruffy, you know, anti-war demonstrators, young men trying to avoid the draft.
The Catonsville action was 9 Catholic lay people and clergy. And I think that reached out to a community beyond the conventional anti-war activists. It made the Catholic community, no matter how conservative, question, because these were priests and former nuns.
The idea about a hit and stay was to take responsibility for the action. It was to commit civil disobedience, and that entailed sticking around and waiting to be arrested and suffering whatever legal consequences resulted. This was new. This was a new tactic.
That was the most expressive, most mobilizing thing I've seen as far as the anti-war movement was concerned.
I had no idea that anybody had in mind that this was the prototype of some series of actions, and that I would be the next one.
It had a tremendous catalytic effect. The numbers in the streets that we could sustain from that moment on would have been impossible without actions like Catonsville 9 and Baltimore 4.
You know, my brother was a perfect example. You know, he graduated from high school, he was going to be a carpenter, he wanted to get a job, he had a girlfriend, he wanted an old Chevy car to have, and wanted to just have a regular old life, you know. He couldn't have found Vietnam on a map if you paid him $20, probably. You were drafted, well, you went. It wasn't like he voluntarily chose to say, yes, this is what I want to do. Did he want to go? I'm sure he didn't want to go. Did he see that there were choices and options? I'm sure he didn't see there were choices and options.
63rd and Western, and this is the building where the draft boards, 32 draft boards covering the whole south side of Chicago, were located here. And we rented an office in the building as a bookstore, and this is where we got into the draft board offices and removed a lot of the material, mountains of files and cards, and burned them outside. We did not endanger the building, or much less endanger the life of anybody in there or anywhere around here.
Today, May 25th, 1969, we enter the Chicago South Side Draft Board Complex at 63rd and Western to remove and burn Selective Service records. We still have a dream of being able to communicate with this society, but we can no longer confine our peacemaking efforts to the ordinary channels of polite discourse, for we are confronting an extremely urgent situation in which the twin evils of American militarism and racism are monstrously interconnected.
Now, Fred, what was your involvement in the anti-war movement before we got involved in the Chicago 15 action?
I'd been an organizer with the resistance in Detroit and made that a more or less full-time job for about a year.
That was the draft resistance?
Yeah.
So, encouraging young people to think about what the war was all about and whether
Doing
they...
draft counseling, we helped some resistors or deserters get across the border into Canada, going down to the induction center at 6 o'clock in the morning and passing out leaflets to the guys who were going in to take their physical.
Okay. Now, were you yourself subject to being drafted?
I was, but I went in for my physical, and the guy, I had a fast pulse before that, and the guy said, "Congratulations, you're at 98. You can be drafted." And I walked over to the doctor at the next booth, and I said, "Could you check my pulse?" And he said it was 180. So just the idea that I was going to be drafted was enough to double it. So. But I had no intention of going, but I was going down to take the physical, hoping that I wouldn't have to.
But your intention was to resist. If you had been called up for induction, you would have refused to take that step over that line.
Right.
Now, how were you analyzing or seeing the war at that time? What was your main objection to it?
I was pretty impressed with Muhammad Ali and his statement that no Viet Cong or Vietnamese had ever called him nigger. it just seemed to me that they hadn't done anything to us, and I couldn't understand why we were killing them by the hundreds of thousands, the millions, even before it was over.
Okay, did you see some historical or situate that whole thing within what I think we developed later probably as an anti-imperialist analysis, you know, with the U.S. basically replacing the French in Indochina, all of that kind of analysis?
Yeah, and domestically too, you know, going back and looking at some of the earlier wars that the United States was involved in and wondering why. The only one that ever made any sense to me was World War II.
Right. Do you think you might have participated in World War II? That's just as an aside.
I think I probably would have.
Okay.
And I went through a period, I applied for conscientious objector, and they rejected me, saying I was insincere. I was going through a personal conflict about was I objecting to all wars or was it a particular war. But I was certainly opposed to the Vietnam War, but I kind of waffled on World War II. I think I would have fought in World War II.
So what was the process of your getting involved in the Chicago 15 action? Did you hear a talk by somebody who had participated in a previous action like that?
Fred Ojow. He came through Detroit, and I was pretty impressed with what he had to say. And I met Phil Berrigan at some point. I can't remember when it was. I just admired what they had done, and I figured I'd take a shot at it.
And so then I know we had a series of meetings and a retreat. I remember a retreat in the Detroit area somewhere that I came to. Did you feel at all nervous or fearful about doing something like that?
Well, I was a little anxious about how much time it might involve, because we were talking about 15 years in prison when we first talked about the action. But I couldn't let that stop me, so I was very glad it only turned out to be a couple of years.
So you felt that even if it had been 15 years, I don't know if I was seeing it in such large terms, but even so, I mean, in view of what was happening there, as you said before, the slaughter of people of Vietnam, the massive bombing that was going on, you just felt that you had to do more, even taking the risks that involved.
Yep, it was absolutely necessary.
Right. Okay. Now, what was your own participation in the action?
What did I do? I don't know.
Were you in there overnight? Did you stay in?
Yeah, I did that, and I carried the draft files down to the alley behind.
Right.
That was pretty much that.
Right.
I stood around and sang and waited for the cops to come.
Right.
That was another slightly nervous point when the cops showed up with shotguns and stuff.
Right.
So
the poor people of the earth are taught to hate and kill one another in order that the powerful can enjoy the freedom to increase their fortunes through exploitative foreign investments. At the same time, the expansion of war-related industries diverts tax dollars away from the social programs so desperately needed here. Born and raised in poverty and oppression, young men from America's urban ghettos are forced to burn and kill poor peasants in a land of the third world in order to preserve a quote-unquote freedom which they themselves do not even enjoy in their own land.
The draft boards located here covered the whole south side of Chicago. And so the people who were registered here were members of minority groups, especially blacks and Hispanics, who were inducted and served in Vietnam in very disproportionate numbers. So part of our reason for choosing this particular set of draft boards was to dramatize that.
It is not by accident that we perform our act of creative destruction at the Draft Board Center, which menaces the South Side of Chicago. As white Americans, we bear a special responsibility with regard to the Selective Service system and the war machine it feeds, and we can no longer allow that system to function smoothly in our name, for we cannot tolerate the atrocities it perpetrates upon our brothers in America, in Vietnam, and in other parts of the world. Our action is negative, but also creative, for there is implied in our loud no a quiet but hopeful yes in our elimination of part of a death-dealing and oppressive system, the prelude to the creation of life and freedom.
Gian Pietra was standing on the sidewalk right about there, but in a way that I was able to see him from the alley where I was parked in the car. And so John was there, and the signal was when he would lift the briefcase that he was carrying, that meant that he saw some police cars in the vicinity. So when we saw the people upstairs could also see John. I'll show you where the people were in first of all, they were in our office, and then when they saw that the coast was clear, that John was giving the signal that he did not see any police cars around, then they broke in to the draft board offices on the second floor. So our people were in this building, and I remember that they started coming down this fire escape with the draft records, the draft files, and I was waiting out here in this alley. There was a church right here, and I was parked between the church and this building, a private building, which the Selective Service system had rented for their purposes of running the draft boards. We had rented an office in this building. We called it the Mount Carmel Bookstore, and our people were in there in the office all night. That is the night of May 24th over into May 25th of 1969. And at one point at about 5 a.m., they broke into the draft board offices and started gathering up all the files. And then at one point they started coming down this fire escape with all the files. I was waiting out here in the car, and I had the gasoline, which we used to douse the draft material and set it on fire. First, the fire department arrived and started putting out the fire. We waited here. It was a civil disobedience action where you do an action committing civil disobedience and then you wait for arrest, partly because we wanted to make it a public protest. So we wanted to be able to state publicly why we had done that and why we were opposed to the Vietnam War and the draft. So very shortly the Chicago police arrived and took us away to police station and then to Cook County Jail, where we spent a few days before we were bailed out. We were first charged with burglary and arson by the state of Illinois, and then by the federal government with 4 counts in an indictment, including destruction of government property, interfering with the Selective Service system, and conspiracy to do those things. And then after a while, the state dropped their charges, and we were prosecuted by the federal government. And then during the trial, did you try to make some statements or try to get some of your reasons out during the trial?
Yeah, I didn't show up for trial. I went into sanctuary in Detroit. And the FBI came and got me and took me to Chicago. 99 times I didn't stand for the judge when he came in. I told him it wasn't intended to be disrespect for him, but that I respect the system that was sending men to die and kill in an unjust war.
Right.
So I got an extra 297,
Right.
3 days for each 99 times I didn't stand.
Right, but then that was reversed, right? On appeal, and you
Yeah.
ended up getting credit for that time
Yeah, I did.
that you had
Well,
served for contempt.
Right. It was like, I think I was in prison a little longer than I would have been because that was on my record. And when they finally reversed it, I'd already done a chunk of that time. So,
Okay.
but I felt good about doing that.
Our trial was held in the Federal Building in Chicago. Our trial lasted about a month in 1970. We tried to present some of our reasons for the protest action, but the judge basically refused to allow us to present anything about the Vietnam War or the draft. And so at the end of our 30-day trial, we were found guilty of all 4 counts in the indictment, and we were sentenced to basically 5 years in prison plus 5 on probation. Most of us were sentenced to that. I'm now riding with my good friend Joe Check. We're returning home after our visit to 63rd and Western, where the draft boards were located when we did the action in 1969.
I did not know it was going to take place, and I knew that something was up, but I didn't know what. Didn't know what my friend Joe Mulligan was going to do. We were just part of the support network from that very point on, all the way to the end.
Right. And did anybody involved in this movement of civil disobedience ever ask you and Betty to consider getting involved personally in this type of action?
Well, we had some months later, we had a nice conversation in our apartment with Father Phil Berrigan, who came by for a cup of coffee, and yeah, we discussed that possibility. And Phil was very, very pastoral and nice and gentle, and agreed with us that we were, with a small baby, we were not in a position to be a part of direct action directly. But that our support was very important. So that's what we did.
Right.
After that, we visited lots of federal prisons with our baby in tow in a little blue Volkswagen Bug.
Now, what about your prison experience? Did you see that as overall being negative, harmful towards you, or were you able to deal with it and make something tolerable or even positive out of it?
Yeah, I haven't read as much of my life as I did while I was in there. That was the way I spent most of my days. Played some softball with the drafter sisters. Made some good friends, people that were in for other political episodes. And the guy that was married to Joan Baez, he had spoken in Ann Arbor one time about packing the jails with draft resistors, and he said that you should look at prison as something you go through and not to, and don't get stuck in it. So it wasn't horrible. It was boring was the biggest problem.
You were on the bakery
Yeah.
crew, right?
Yeah. And I just didn't feel that I wanted to ask them for anything special, so I just stayed where they put me.
Right.
and they gave me a certificate as a baker, and then I can bake bread for 500, but I have a hard time doing it for 6.
Okay. And then, so you did about 2 years?
2.5, 31 months.
31 months, actually at Sandstone, 31 months, or did you do some time at a...
Did they count the time in Cook County that
we're
about a month there?
About a month. I think they did, yeah.
Yeah, so
Okay.
maybe 30.
All right, you were not released to a halfway house, or...
No.
But you were released on parole?
Yeah, and
Right.
that was like the first time I went in for a parole hearing, the guy on the other side of the table said, "My son's in Vietnam." He said, "Why should I release you?" And I just thought, okay, if you're not going to release me. And I gave him a reason. I just said, well, I was trying to keep your son from dying, but it didn't work.
No, they turned you down the first time.
Yeah, right.
Mm-hmm.
And then I did finally that. Within the next year, I wrote to request reconsideration of my sentence, and that's when they gave me parole.
Mm-hmm.
I was only notified a few days before I was released that I was getting out. Those were happy days.
So you finished out the 5 years on parole. We had a 5-year prison sentence, as I recall.
Well, actually, I think it seems like it was a year, and then they just dropped it.
They cut
Parole officers had more important people to deal with, I guess.
Right. And so then what did you do after you got out? Did you continue in some way in peace movement activities?
Well, mainly labor activities after that. I went to work in a bookstore, and after I'd been there for a couple of years, we tried to organize it several times, but did eventually organize it into the Industrial Workers of the World. I got elected to be General Secretary Treasurer of the IWW, did that for 5 years. I don't know, I supported a lot of causes, but I haven't been directly active in much else.
What was it about the Wobblies that attracted you? Did you find the philosophy of the Wobblies?
Yeah, well, I mean, their analysis of what the bosses were doing to the workers, I certainly agreed with that. And the heroes, Joe Hill and Big Bill Haywood, and some of those people that had remarkable stories. It was the most democratic union that I had ever encountered. I'd been in the UAW and United Food and Commercial Workers, and I didn't like the way they treated their members all the time.
Fred, I know that currently you're taking care of your dad, and what is his situation and your own health situation as well?
Well, he's in home hospice, and I've been living with him for 5 years, but it's gotten a little worse in recent months. So I just do whatever he needs to keep him safe and healthy. I've got bladder cancer. I had it once before and it went into remission, and it's back. No side effects from the treatments. And I'll just keep doing them until they tell me they aren't going to work anymore, or they worked.
So what was your reaction when you found out that Fred and others, including myself, had taken part in the Chicago 15, the burning of draft files in Chicago? What was your first reaction?
I started to think a little bit differently.
So it made you think about the war?
That's right.
Were you upset as to what might happen to your son Fred as a result?
Oh yeah. A few months after the trial, we were having our union convention, national convention. I made a motion that the president of the country within their power to stop the war.
And what union was that?
CWA, Communication Workers.
Okay, so you proposed a motion to condemn the war in Vietnam,
Right,
to object to the, and it passed. Did it pass?
Do everything I could to stop it.
Uh-huh. So the union passed, they approved your motion?
No.
No.
No. There was couple thousand people at the convention, and I think there was about 50 of them agreed with me.
Oh, okay. Because it shows that Fred's action had an impact on his own family.
That's right.
When you called for them to reject the Vietnam War, what was your argument? How did you see the injustice? What did you think was wrong about the Vietnam War?
Well, I just didn't think that we had any good reason to be there.
I take it then you admired your son. You were proud of him for being faithful to his conscience and taking action.
That's right.
Okay.